We sit down with one of New York's top brain injury attorneys to find out what your legal rights are if you or a loved one has suffered this type of injury. We have a lot to get to, so stay right here because today's verdict starts right now. Welcome to today's verdict, the show that gives you your legal rights and options. I'm your host and trial attorney for the next 30 minutes, David Lesh. Each year, an estimated 1.7 million children and adults in the United States suffer a traumatic brain injury. According to the Center for Disease Control, another 795,000 sustain an acquired brain injury from non-traumatic causes each year. Brain injuries have made their way from emergency rooms to courtrooms. Joining us today is one of New York's top traumatic brain injury trial lawyers, Michael Flomenhaft. Mr. Flomenhaft has represented countless victims of traumatic brain injury in both New York City and in courtrooms throughout the United States. Now he is here to give us a much-needed primer on the legal definition of traumatic brain injury. Mr. Flomenhaft, I have to tell you, I've seen you in action. I can't think of anybody better to have as a guest when it comes to an attorney talking about a traumatic brain injury.
Thanks, David.
Okay. Client comes to you possibly with an issue of a brain injury. What's the first thing that you do?
The first thing I do is try and find out either from them or from their family, is the person changed? Has his personality changed? Is he irritable? Does he have problems with his memory? Is he different in any particular way, as in terms of the person they knew before the event that the accident that they're coming to me for?
Well, does the client actually think there's nothing wrong and that they just maybe be a little forgetful? Is it the family members who seem to know that there's a traumatic brain injury before the client even knows?
Well, family members don't usually know that there's a traumatic brain injury. I mean, that's a medical classification that they frequently don't get. What they know if they're asked is that their loved one is not the same. In terms of the client, he or she may or may not know if they're the same. I mean, that requires insight, and that insight is part of the brain, and that part of the brain that gives you insight that something's different may have been damaged.
Listen, you present the medicine to a jury very well. So let's talk a little bit about the brain itself.
Right.
You know, what's going on up there when it comes to a trauma? Is it always from an external force? Is it from something else? Tell us a little bit about it.
I think the really important thing to understand at the outset is that a brain is about 2.3 pounds of essentially almost the same consistency of Jell-O. I mean, it's a very, very fragile structure. It's not a structure. If you can think of 2.3 pounds of Jell-O, it's not a structure that was designed to withstand the types of traumas that we subject it to, whether it be motor vehicle accidents or construction falls or contact sports. And so it's very vulnerable to injury. Yet this 2.3 pounds of Jell-O really determine who we are, or define who we are, determine the whole course of our lives.
Okay, now once you find out or you think that a client might have this type of injury,
right,
what type of treatment are they getting? You know, certainly for at least trial preparation, are you sending them to a particular doctor? How are they being evaluated?
Okay, well, I'm very proactive in terms of investigating that brain injury. With all due respect to the medical community, the types of assessments, whether in terms of doctor's visits or in terms of imaging, that people will get to assess brain injury are fairly superficial. And people can pass the routine imaging, CAT scan, MRI evaluations, or neurologist assessments.
And not have what's considered to be a traumatic brain injury.
And not be diagnosed with any brain injury. As a matter of fact, be given a clean bill of health, yet in a more probing investigation, in terms of imaging or assessment, be found to have really significant brain damage.
Well, let's talk about some of that probing, because obviously
Sure.
medicine has come a long way. What type of probing are we talking about to be able to show that this person is suffering from something that is a brain injury and not just, you know, something else that somebody might consider just to be mild?
Sure. Well, I mean, mild has its own connotation.
Which we're going to get to, because from what I remember talking offset, mild, moderate, and severe are different. Different classifications. But somebody who has a mild situation can still have a long-term deficit. Am I correct?
Oh, for sure. I mean, mild has its own special significance. But let me answer your question. And so I think I mean, there's so much to say on the subject, but the most important thing I could say at the outset is that the most physicians and most people are guided by imaging, CAT scan or MRI, to determine whether a person has a brain injury. Yet the thing to know is that imaging can show that there is a brain injury, but it can't show that there isn't. And so you can have a negative CAT scan and a negative MRI, and often the physician will say, you know, Mrs. Jones, I have good news for your son is fine. The CAT scan and the MRI was normal. It was negative, meaning it didn't show any brain injury. But the fact is it can only show that there is a brain injury. It can't show it can't. And you can have all sorts of microscopic disruptions of the brain that those imaging modalities are not designed to detect. And the person can be very disrupted.
Well, let's talk about the person.
Sure.
What is the person going through when they suffer this type of injury?
If I could just digress for 1 second.
Sure.
And that is, so what I do is I'll arrange for much more sophisticated and probing studies of the brain, different types of imaging, more sophisticated types of MRIs, electrical profiles of the brain, what they call PET scans to evaluate metabolism of the brain, quantitative computerized analysis of imaging to do a much more probing investigation of a person's brain. But my starting point is not any doctor's diagnosis. My starting point is a loved one saying that since this event, my
Husband,
loved one,
wife, somebody.
they're not the same, and they're not the same in all different ways we can talk about.
Give me an example. How are they not the same?
Their personality is changed. They're irritable. Little things that shouldn't bother them have set them off. They've lost interest in the things that they were interested in. They've lost interest in their loved ones. They're cooking something on the stove, and they forget the stove is on. Or that you'll continuously say the same thing to them over and over again, and they won't even remember that you said it to them. And the family has not gotten any diagnosis, so they don't understand what's going on. All they have is this mounting frustration, and also this sense of loss of who this person was, and confusion as to where they went and why they're not knowing why they're gone.
So now, once they have the diagnosis,
right,
whether they agree with it or not, at least the loved ones have some type of diagnosis. What's the treatment? What do you do for somebody who has this type of injury now?
Okay.
Do they get better?
Well, I think there's opportunity. There are opportunities to get a lot better, depending upon if they're lucky enough to get interventions. I mean, there are more conventional interventions that you'll get from most physicians, and that's if they're cognitive, or what they mean by thinking losses. You can get cognitive therapy that can help give you help give you certain experiences or training to adapt to your losses. There's also what they call neurofeedback that's not as conventionally available, but they use now with American soldiers at military bases that has tremendous promise in terms of helping people really strengthen the brain and strengthen the parts of the brain that have been weakened or damaged by the injury. I mean, I could speak a lot about this. I'm being very quick.
Well, let me ask you about, Tim Bruce was just on from the
Sure.
Brain Injury Association of America. He talked to us about the act that just passed.
Right.
What's your feelings about this particular act? Was it much needed? Long time coming? What do you think?
Well, I mean, I have a few feelings about the act. In some ways, I share Tim's feeling. I mean, it's much needed, and it's a really important step, and the state should be commended in that regard. However, at the end of the day, it's legislation, and legislation is a compromise, and the premise of the legislation, the way I understand the legislation, is that if the student athlete shows that he or she has resolved their signs and symptoms of brain injury, then once they get medical clearance, they can go back on the playing field. What, to me, the deficiency in the act is that it doesn't recognize that even if the signs and symptoms of brain injury have resolved and disappeared, that the brain remains vulnerable to even a more serious brain injury, or it's hit again. From my standpoint,
are you suggesting then that particular child should not be allowed to play in sports at all in
at
school?
least for a year. I mean, if I was my child, If they had a concussion sufficient to produce signs and symptoms of brain injury, they shouldn't. They should not come back for that school year. They should have a really significant hiatus in terms of their return to contact sports. And if they have another concussion down the road, from my standpoint, given what I've observed, and I'm sure a lot of coaches will hate me for saying this, the parents should consider removing that child, no matter how much of a fight it's going to be at home, from contact sports forever.
Okay, let's get
the brain
back.
is that vulnerable to serious injury.
All right, let's get into the courtroom right now.
Sure.
All right, you're presenting your case to 6 jurors, 2 alternates, and you're trying to portray what? What are you trying to show the jurors, really?
Well, that's a really challenging question. It's different for every person because the brain, the profile of brain injury and how it affects a person's self and how their life is different for everyone. But I'm trying to do so. It's a different challenge. It's not like a cookie cutter. It's a different challenge for every single client. But there are 2 things I'm trying to do. I'm trying to number one, show objectively and scientifically what's going on in the brain and show that to the jury. But what I'm also trying to do, and I'll do that with imaging, I'll do that with a variety of tests and a variety of experts. What I'm also trying to do is, to the best I can, to inhabit that person and inhabit the predicament that their brain injury has caused for them and their family, and reenact that in the courtroom so the jury can feel the loss of parts of the self that have occurred as a result of that brain injury.
You've seen hundreds of these types of cases.
Right.
Do you seem to see more children, young adults? Who's walking into the office with these types of injuries? And before you answer that, what types of incidents are causing? Is it strictly car accident cases? Are we getting trip and falls? What's causing it? And who seems to be the more likely client?
Okay, that's 5 questions
I
in
know,
one.
I asked so many, I just throw them all at you.
Okay, so let me say, first of all, that most of my cases do not involve impact to the head. That you do not need impact to the head to produce a brain injury. Just the whiplash motion or the sudden stopping, mostly occurring in motor vehicle accidents, is enough to whip the brain inside the soft brain inside the hard skull to damage that brain.
Like shaking baby syndrome.
Like shaking baby
has
syndrome.
nothing to do with the trauma.
Right.
Nobody hit the baby's head, but the shaking of the head causes the trauma.
Right. So every whiplash situation has the potential for brain injury. Most of my clients are women.
Really?
And the reason why most of my clients are women who suffer brain injury is that because of the relative fragility, I mean, not fragility, but fragility and delicacy of women's neck musculature compared to men, their ability to withstand whiplash without and not have the brain stabilize is much less than a man. So a much lesser impact is necessary, is sufficient to inflict brain injury in a woman than a man. In terms of children and adults, most of my cases involve adults. I think the good news when it comes to children compared to adults is that children can withstand a brain injury and have a much better trajectory and potential for recovery. I mean, the brain can grow internally, can establish connections internally. I mean, you see the types of brain growth that happens in children and even teenagers that you don't see in adults.
Yeah, but you're not growing new brain cells.
No, you're not growing new brain cells, but you can establish new connections between brain cells that really can compensate for loss. So the child's brain is much more resilient than the adult's brain. So the opportunity for full recovery is much greater in children than in adults.
We don't have that much more time,
Sure.
and I know the viewers are going to want to get to you. So
Sure.
tell them how do they find you?
Well, they can. My contact information is on my website. That's www.neurolawny.com. My phone number is 646-747-0300.
Any final tips you want to give to somebody who's watching and saying, "Oh, I think my daughter or my son has this type of situation." tips.
Sure. The most important thing I could say is that if your daughter or your son has had an event which has the potential to affect their brain, any sort of traumatic event, that even if the physician you went to or you've gone to consult about that concern doesn't detect it, or says he or she sees nothing, but you feel that there's something wrong, because in certain ways you can diagnose your child better than any physician, keep on going until you find someone more specialized to really help you, really assess it some more.
Well, Michael, once again, I've seen you in action. I want to thank you for coming, and I hope you'll come back to give us some more tips.
Thanks for this opportunity, David.
My pleasure. Well, that's all for tonight. It's now time to deliberate. I'd like to thank both of our guests for joining us and, of course, you for watching. Remember, if there's a legal issue or topic you would like to see on the show, email me at davidlesh@bronxnet.org. And until we see you again, always remember, know your rights, know your issues, reach your verdict. We'll see you next time.